Lisa walked into her local Ford dealership in Manchester last month, wanting to buy a new family car. She'd done her research, had £28,000 saved up, and knew exactly what she wanted. A Ford Focus estate with a petrol engine. Practical, reliable, affordable to run. The salesman looked at her almost apologetically and said, "We don't really stock those anymore. Can I show you our electric Mustang Mach-E instead?" Lisa explained she lived in a flat with no charging point and regularly drove 300 miles to visit family in Scotland. "The Mach-E starts at £50,000, the salesman continued, ignoring her concerns. "We have excellent finance options." Lisa left the dealership, confused and frustrated. The car she wanted, the car that actually suited her life, was being deliberately pushed aside for an electric vehicle she couldn't afford and couldn't practically use. This scene is playing out in dealerships across Britain, America, and Europe every single day. Customers walk in wanting affordable petrol cars and walk out either empty-handed or pressured into electric vehicles that don't fit their needs or budgets. Car manufacturers have made a collective decision. The future is electric, whether you like it or not, whether it makes sense for you or not, whether you can afford it or not. But here's what nobody's asking. Why? Why this sudden, coordinated rush to electric? Why are brands that built their reputations on petrol engines suddenly acting like they're desperate to abandon them? The answer isn't what they're telling you. This isn't about saving the planet. This isn't about consumer demand. This is about money, regulation, and corporate survival. Let's start with what they want you to believe. Open any car manufacturer's website, watch any automotive commercial, read any press release, they'll tell you the same story. We're committed to a sustainable future. Our customers want electric vehicles. Technology has reached a tipping point. It sounds noble, responsible, forward-thinking. It's also mostly nonsense. The reality is far more complex and far more driven by forces that have nothing to do with what's best for customers. The first force is government regulation, and it's the big one. Across the developed world, governments have imposed aggressive mandates that essentially outlaw petrol cars within the next decade. The UK government has announced that all new cars sold from 2035 must be zero. The European Union has banned the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2035. California, which sets automotive policy for much of America due to its market size, has mandated that all new cars must be zero emission by 2035, and other states are following. These aren't suggestions or targets. These are legal requirements with massive penalties for non-compliance. For car manufacturers, this creates an existential problem. They can't just flip a switch in 2034 and suddenly produce only electric cars. They need years to develop models, build supply chains, establish battery production, train workers, and transition factories. Which means they need to start now. They need to kill off petrol models, redirect investment to EVs, and fundamentally restructure their entire businesses. The electric push you're seeing isn't because they believe EVs are ready or because customers are demanding them. It's because governments have given them no choice. Adopt or die. But here's where it gets interesting. These regulations came with carrots as well as sticks. Governments offered manufacturers billions in subsidies, tax breaks, and incentives to develop electric vehicles. The U.S. Inflation Reduction Act allocated $369 billion for clean energy and transportation, with massive subsidies for EV manufacturing. The EU has committed €3 billion in direct support for battery production. The UK has provided £850 million in grants for zero-emission vehicle development. Manufacturers looked at this and saw profit. If they could successfully transition to EV, they'd receive enormous government support, while also positioning themselves as environmental leaders. Then there's the emissions regulation game, which is perhaps the most cynical part of this entire story. In Europe, manufacturers face fleet average CO2 emission target. For 2024, the average across all cars a manufacturer sells cannot exceed 93.6 grams of CO2 per kilometer. Miss that target, and they pay €95 for every gram over the limit, multiplied by every car sold. For a major manufacturer selling 2 million vehicles a year and missing the target by just 5 grams per kilometer, that's a fine of €950 million. Just for 1 year. These fines are bankrupting level serious. So how do manufacturers meet these targets? Electric vehicles. EVs are counted as zero emissions in these calculations, even though the electricity generating them often comes from fossil fuels. But on paper, for regulatory purposes, they're clean. Every EV manufacturer sells dramatically lowers their fleet average. Sell enough EVs, and you can offset your profitable petrol cars and avoid fines. This has created perverse incentives where manufacturers actually lose money on many EVs, but have to sell them anyway to avoid even bigger losses from emissions, fines. Volkswagen's CEO admitted in 2023 that the company was selling EVs at a loss, sometimes significant losses, but had to do it for emissions compliance. Tesla has made billions, not from car sales, but from selling emissions credits to other manufacturers who haven't sold enough EVs. It's a bizarre system where making actual cars is less profitable than gaming regulatory frameworks. And the manufacturers caught in this trap have one strategy: force as many people as possible into EVs as quickly as possible, whether those vehicles make economic or practical sense. Now let's talk about the economics of actually building cars, because this reveals another major driver behind the EV push. Traditional petrol engines are mechanically complex, thousands of moving parts, intricate manufacturing processes, expensive materials, skilled labor requirements. They're difficult and costly to build. Electric drivetrains, by comparison, are remarkably simple. An electric motor has perhaps 20 moving parts. There's no transmission, no complex fuel injection system, no exhaust, no cooling system of the same complexity. McKinsey published analysis showing that by 2030, the production cost of an EV could be 20 to 30% lower than an equivalent petrol vehicle, assuming battery costs continue declining. For manufacturers drowning in complexity costs and looking at shrinking profit margins on traditional cars, this is incredibly appealing. An EV future is a future where they can build cars more cheaply, with less specialized labor and more automated factories. It's a future where their cost structures improve dramatically. But here's the catch. We're not at 2030 yet. Right now, in 2025, EVs are still more expensive to produce than petrol cars, primarily because batteries remain costly. The average battery pack costs around $100 to $130 per kilo. A 75 kilowatt-hours battery, which is typical for a decent range, costs £7,500, $10,000 just for the battery. That's before you've built the rest of the car. So why are they pushing them so hard now? Because they're betting on the future. They're losing money today to position themselves for a profitable tomorrow. Once battery costs drop below $80 per kWh, which industry projections suggest will happen by 2027 to 2028, EVs become cheaper to produce than petrol cars. There's also a strategic component involving China that Western manufacturers are terrified to discuss publicly. China has become the world's dominant EV manufacturer. Companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng are producing millions of electric vehicles at price points Western manufacturers can't touch. BYD sold 3 million EVs in 2023 alone. They're exporting aggressively to Europe, undercutting established brands by £10,000 to £15,000 on similar vehicles. European and American manufacturers looked at this and realized that if they don't transition to EVs quickly, Chinese brands will capture the entire market. The logic goes like this. If Western manufacturers stick with petrol cars, they might maintain market share temporarily, but they'll be completely unprepared when the EV market matures. Chinese brands will have a decade head start in production scale, battery technology, and cost efficiency. They'll flood Western markets with cheap EVs that nobody can compete with. So Western manufacturers made a calculation. We must force an AV transition now, even if consumers aren't ready, even if infrastructure isn't ready, even if we lose money, because the alternative is Chinese dominance in 10 years. Let's also examine the profit potential in the EV ecosystem, because manufacturers see revenue streams beyond just selling cars. EVs create opportunities for ongoing revenue that petrol cars never offered. Subscription services for features already installed in the car. Over-the-air software updates that can be monetized. Proprietary charging networks where manufacturers take a cut of every charge. Data collection and sale EVs generate massive amounts of data about driving patterns, locations, and behavior that has commercial value. BMW made headlines by trying to charge a subscription fee for heated seats already installed in the car. Tesla charges for full self-driving software. Manufacturers are building charging networks where they control pricing. This isn't about selling you a car anymore. It's about selling you a car and then extracting ongoing revenue for years afterward. EVs enable this in ways petrol cars never could because they're fundamentally software-based platforms. For manufacturers looking at stagnant car sales and razor-thin margins, this is incredibly attractive. Then there's brand positioning and investor pressure. In the 2020s, ESG environmental, social, and governance criteria became dominant in investment decisions. Major institutional investors began avoiding companies seen as environmentally harmful. Car manufacturers dependent on fossil fuel vehicles fell into this category. Their stock prices suffered. Simultaneously, Tesla's valuation exploded, at one point exceeding the combined value of the top 10 traditional automakers despite producing a fraction of their vehicles. Wall Street made clear: electric equals value, petrol equals liability. Traditional manufacturers faced pressure from their own boards and shareholders to pivot to EV, regardless of current profitability, because the market was rewarding EV-focused companies with insane valuations. Ford's stock jumped 40% after announcing aggressive EV plans. GM saw similar gains. The message was clear: go electric or watch your stock price collapse. CEO compensation often ties to stock performance. When boards and investors make clear that EV commitment drives stock prices, CEOs have personal financial incentives to push EVs aggressively. Now, let's talk about what this means for actual consumers. Manufacturers are discontinuing popular petrol models left and right. Ford killed the Fiesta and Focus in Europe. Volkswagen is phasing out the Golf in many markets. BMW discontinued multiple petrol models. Audi has announced it will produce its last new combustion engine in 2026. These aren't niche vehicles. These are mass-market cars that millions of people rely on. In their place, manufacturers are pushing EVs that cost 40 to 60% more. The cars people can actually afford are disappearing. The Ford Focus Lisa wanted cost £22,000. The Mach-E she was shown costs £50,000. That's not a replacement. That's a completely different market segment. But manufacturers don't care because they're not optimizing for customer needs. They're optimizing for regulatory compliance and future positioning. Infrastructure is nowhere near ready for mass EV adoption. The UK has roughly 50,000 public charging points for over 1 million EVs already on the road. That's one charger for every 20 EVs. Range anxiety remains a real issue. Charging times, even with fast chargers, are 20 to 45 minutes. For people who can't charge at home, which is roughly 40% of UK households who don't have off-street parking, EVs are fundamentally impractical. There's also the environmental hypocrisy worth highlighting. Manufacturers market EVs as zero-emission vehicles saving the planet, but battery production is environmentally catastrophic. Lithium mining destroys ecosystems. Cobalt extraction, much of it from the Democratic Republic of Congo using child labor, is a humanitarian disaster. The carbon footprint of producing an EV is significantly higher than producing a petrol car. Studies from Volvo and Polestar show that an EV needs to be driven 50,000 to 70,000 miles before its lifetime. Carbon footprint becomes lower than an equivalent petrol vehicle. But manufacturers don't mention this. They don't talk about the environmental costs of battery production. They don't discuss the fact that electricity grids in many countries still run primarily on fossil fuels, meaning EVs are essentially coal-powered cars with extra steps. The environmental argument is marketing, not reality. The real drivers are regulation and profit. The class implications of this transition are profound. Wealthy people who can afford £45,000 EVs, who have garages with charging points, who have second cars for long trips, will be fine. They'll actually benefit from lower running costs and government incentives. But working-class people who rely on affordable used cars, who live in flats without charging, who drive for work and can't afford downtime for charging, they're being left behind. The EV transition is regressive, transferring wealth upward while making transportation more difficult and expensive for those least able to afford it. So why is every brand forcing EV? Because governments have mandated it with penalties that make non-compliance impossible. Because manufacturers see a future where EVs are more profitable to produce and enable ongoing revenue streams. Because Wall Street rewards EV commitment with higher valuations. Because Chinese competition threatens to dominate if Western manufacturers don't pivot quickly. Because emissions regulations create perverse incentives where losing money on EVs is cheaper than paying fines. It's not about saving the planet. It's not about what customers want. It's not about whether the technology is ready or infrastructure exists. It's about corporate survival in a regulatory environment that's made petrol cars untenable, combined with a bet that EVs will eventually be more profitable. Consumers are collateral damage in this transition. Your needs, your budget, your practical requirements, none of that matters. What matters is regulatory compliance and positioning for a future market that may or may not materialize as predicted. That's not progress. That's just business.